Good morning, everyone. The reading for this sermon video is Jonah chapter 4. So go ahead and read Jonah chapter 4 before you jump into the rest of this video. This morning is our final sermon series in the sermon series we've been doing on the short stories, the shortest books in the Bible. And I hope you've enjoyed our time looking at these lesser-known portions of the Scripture. Maybe you've learned something. My greatest hope is that you've gotten a glimpse of just how deep, rich, and profound even the more often ignored corners of our Bible really are. It is just one of life's joys. I am fully convinced to experience God speaking to you through the beauty and the complexity of these sorts of stories. So I really, really hope that you'll take some time in the near future to reread Ruth or Jonah or Philemon or whatever to rediscover this for yourself. Looking forward, turn off my AC unit real quick. Looking forward, the next month is a little bit scattered with a variety of summer events and trips sprinkled in. So we're not going to be immediately jumping into a new sermon series, and there may not be a new video each and every week because I'm going to be out of town at some different periods during the next few months. So we'll have a couple standalone sermons, and then we will launch a brand new sermon series and consistently post videos again in about mid-August. So look forward to that. Before any of that comes up, though, we're going to spend one more week with our friend, the hapless prophet Jonah, Dove, son of faithfulness, as we learned that his name could be translated in the last video. And last week, we were really tough on Jonah, or I was at least. And I don't think you can really blame me. Jonah is one of the more frustrating and distasteful characters in the whole Bible. He's God's chosen prophet, but rather than following God's directions, he runs away to the other side of the world, to Timbuktu, and he causes all sorts of problems for people along the way. He's arrogant, he's oblivious the entire time, and I don't even feel that sorry for him when he gets swallowed by a giant fish at the end of chapter 1. And honestly, it would be pretty easy to just keep bashing on Jonah, to just pile it on as we go through the last chapter of the book this week. Jonah is at maybe his most petulant, his most childish in chapter 4. Do y'all know the look that a kid gets right before they throw a giant tantrum with like the hunched shoulders and the scrunched face, and their whole body is just tensed up as they get ready to unleash on everybody all around them? I think that's how we should picture Jonah right before the beginning of chapter 4. Because remember, at this point in the story, his sermon has been widely successful, the most successful sermon in the history of sermons. The entire city of Nineveh, including the livestock, have repented of their sins in dust and ashes and turned to the one true God. And God, being merciful and gracious, has decided to withhold the punishment that he had planned for the city. And Jonah is ticked. He is so unbelievably angry, and his anger boils over. It explodes all over the page in Jonah chapter 4 in a truly childish tantrum. He begins by spitting the strangest set of insults at God. He says, I knew you were merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and it drives me nuts. After he's given God a piece of his mind, he stomps out to the edge of the city of Nineveh, to, the text tells us, see what would happen to the city. So he is still thinking to himself, I better see some fire and brimstone, dang it. And God, seemingly concerned for this wailing child that he sees in front of him, causes a plant to grow up over Jonah to give him shade. And the plant apparently made Jonah very happy. That's the Hebrew word for great, for huge, for big again. It's gadol. So Jonah was super angry, and then once the plant pops up, he's super happy. He's just all over the place, insanely furious, super happy. And then when the plant dies, he's literally suicidal. He looks at the plant and Jonah, the dead plant, and he just says, you know what, I'd rather be dead. And then God asks him, very reasonably and compassionately in verse 9, he says, hey, Jonah, buddy, do you think that it's right for you to be so upset about this plant? Think there's any chance that you're overreacting here? And what does Jonah say? He just doubles down. He says, yes, it is totally justified. I want to die. And the book ends with the Lord's final leading question to Jonah. The Lord just asked Jonah, if you care so much about this little plant, which was not even here yesterday, do you think I could also care, maybe, for an entire city of living people who don't know their right hand from their left, and also many cattle? And then it ends. It's a very strange ending to a book, isn't it? It's very abrupt. There's no closure. What was Jonah's response? Did he ever figure it out? Did he ever calm down and realize how God's mercy and God's grace, they're not his to dole out to whoever he thinks deserve it and to be kept back from those that he thinks don't deserve it? We don't know. The author decided not to tell us. It's a very strange way to end a book, and we're going to come back to that. So kind of remember that. Strange ending to the book of Jonah. So yeah, it'd be very easy to spend the morning laughing at and piling up on Jonah. It might even be productive if we remember that Jonah is standing in for the people of God. In other words, for you and for me, lifting up our flaws and our shortcomings for us to see and consider and wrestle with. But we did that last week. This week, I want to take a different approach. We're going to try and sympathize with Jonah. We're going to try and get inside of his head to figure out why he feels the way that he does and why he reacts the way that he does. And I think that we might find ourselves empathizing with Jonah. And if we can, I think that we'll find ourselves in this character once again, but in a very different way. So that's the agenda. That's what we're going to try to accomplish this morning. These are reliefs that were dug up. They're preserved by archaeologists. I think they're currently residing in a museum in Britain, but they are from the palace of the ancient king of Assyria. Assyria was the most brutal and violent civilization in history, at least up to that point. They were at war for their entire existence. They were attempting to conquer as much of the known world as they possibly could using horrific tactics. One thing that they would do is after they conquered a city, if you're in Grifton, let's say that they conquered Kinston, right? Let's say Assyria has conquered Kinston. They would take the skeletons and the skulls of the conquered army and put them up on stakes on the hills outside of the town. So that we here in Grifton, and we're currently free from Assyrian rule, we would look over at Kinston and we would see on the hills what had happened to our neighbors, and we would know that we were sure to be next. And these reliefs, they were constructed along the hallway leading to the inner chamber of the king. So the idea was that if you were a foreigner, maybe you were a foreign leader coming to discuss terms of surrender or something, if you had business with the king, you would have to walk by all of these scenes depicting the unspeakable power and brutality of the Assyrian emperor and of the brutality of the king's armies. You can see in this next picture, I got some of the close-ups from these grisly sculptures. You can see the bodies being put up on sticks. The top left is some sort of torture method. The bottom depicts Assyria's siege weaponry trampling on some of the empire's victims. And so let's say you're walking through this hallway. By the time that you were granted audience with the king, the idea is that you would just be a puddle of fear, melting in the face of Assyria's might and their just blatant evil. And I want to ask y'all, do you have any guesses as to what the capital city of Assyria was? The capital city of this brutal, evil, ancient empire. It was Nineveh. Of course it was Nineveh. And I hope that it's a bit easier to sympathize with Jonah now. His tantrum is a bit more understandable. We get it. Why Jonah was not eager to offer God's infamous grace and mercy to a people like this, who had spent the last half century terrorizing Israel, Jonah's own country, and all of her neighbors. We might even find ourselves agreeing with Jonah. These people, they just cannot get off scot-free. If there was ever a time for fire and brimstone, to just set up our lawn chairs east of the city and wait for divine judgment to rain down, this has got to be it. But, I mean, divine mercy, divine grace, it's just not the time or the place. This is Eva Kor. Eva is a Holocaust survivor. I think she only died a couple years ago, actually. And she and her twin sister were among those that the Nazis used for experimentation, human experimentation at the Concentracamp in Auschwitz. And if you've ever have a chance to read her story or people that went through that, it's hard to get through, honestly. Very few people in history have experienced evil in the way that Eva and her twin sister Miriam did. And unlike their parents and their two older sisters, the twins were somehow able to survive until the camp was liberated by Allied forces in the year 1945. And they both went on to live full lives after the war. And later in life, Eva made the shocking decision to publicly forgive the doctors who had tortured her and her sister. There was a ceremony and everything with a former Nazi doctor and Eva's family gathered at the ruins of Auschwitz. There was a forgiveness ceremony. And afterwards, Eva started what's called the Forgiveness Project, which is an organization dedicated to healing from the trauma of the Holocaust through offering forgiveness to its perpetrators. And I don't know how you react to that story. You may just think it's an inspiring story, and it is. But Eva has actually received a lot of criticism and pushback, some of it incredibly passionate, even aggressive, specifically because of her decision to publicly forgive her tormentors. And there's definitely some important clarifications, I think, to be made about who is the authority to forgive who for what. If I were to just state, I, Caleb Punt, I totally forgive the soldiers at Auschwitz, that's a meaningless statement, right? It has nothing to do with me. I don't have that authority. But even Eva's personal decision to forgive those responsible for her trauma and her work with the Forgiveness Project, it's been met with a lot of strong, passionate disagreement. People claiming that she should not forgive, that forgiveness is simply not appropriate when the crimes are this terrible. I think you could probably find yourself sympathizing with that. I can, at least, if I'm being honest. It's difficult to believe that forgiveness and mercy and grace are really appropriate in certain situations like this. What we are circling around here, what we are seeing, I think, peek through the story of Jonah and the legacy of someone like Eva Kor and people's reactions to her life's work, is what I've started to think of as the hard edge to God's grace. Normally we love grace, right? Grace is the best. It is a warm and fuzzy religious word. It makes us feel good. At our in-person worship service at Grifton UMC this past week, we started with singing Amazing Grace. It was awesome. I always love singing that song. It brings a tear to my eye more often than not. But I think that we do find in certain situations that God's amazing grace has a difficult to swallow edge to it. We find that we love grace in this situation, and in this situation. But here, towards those people who have done that, is grace really appropriate there? And man, it is crazy how just a little reflection, a little shift in perspective can change how we see a story, isn't it? I look back at chapter 4, and Jonah is not as much the petulant child that he was a few minutes ago. In fact, maybe he's the more grounded character. He's the more realistic one. It's really God who's not seeing clearly, who's let his own grace run wild. He's allowing a few moments of repentance cover up for years and years of terrible, terrible sin. And so we are left with the questions. Why does God say the things that he says? Why does God do the things that he does? Why is God so insistent with his leading questions and his object lesson with the tree? He's so insistent that Jonah comes to his point of view, to accept that the mercy and grace shown towards Nineveh, far from being inappropriate, is actually a good and right and true expression of God's character. How could that possibly be the case? Well, as we have seen throughout this sermon series on short stories of the Bible, I think the key lies in the details, in the words on the page, the clues and the hints that the author of this incredible story has left for us readers to find and consider after close reading and reflection. And we're going to look at a couple of those details together this morning to see if we too might be able to come to the Lord's point of view on this difficult issue. So the first detail is not technically located in the words of chapter 4 per se. It's slightly more abstract. Last week, I mentioned that some scholars, some people think that the book of Jonah is not necessarily meant to be read as straight history, but might be a kind of parable-like tale where the author has taken a historical figure, Jonah, and has spun a story around him with his main character in order to make certain points. And one of the reasons that people think this is because Jonah is just a very appropriate character to pick for this particular story. For one thing, his name means Dove, Son of Faithfulness, which is just a hilarious name for such a terrible, dislikable character. But there are other reasons as well. This is a passage from the book of 2 Kings. And the King's narrative, which is broken up into the books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, it tells the story of Israel's downfall as a kingdom. The rulers of Israel, the kings, are constantly turning away from God. And as the just result of their rebellion and unfaithfulness, God allows the kingdom to weaken and to progressively start breaking apart. Occasionally there's a good king like Josiah who directs the people back towards God, and so God recognizes the effort and restores Israel's fortunes. But mostly we hear about bad, evil kings and about God's corresponding judgment. But this little section, this is the only place where Jonah appears elsewhere in the Bible besides the book that bears his name. And it stands out. It breaks the normal pattern of the king's narrative. And I'm going to read it for you now, and I want you to see if you can pick out what is strange about it. In the 15th year of Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria, and he ruled for 41 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel, from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant, his prophet Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath Hepher. For the Lord had seen how bitterly everyone in Israel, whether slave or free, was suffering, for there was no one to help them. So remember, the normal pattern in the king's narrative, if we have a good king, God smiles on his people, and the nation of Israel's fortunes are good. If there's a bad king, then God allows his people to be punished. Is that what we have here? It's not, is it? If we're paying very close attention. Jonah apparently was a prophet under a bad king, the second Jeroboam, who did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord and who continued in the sins of his namesake, the first king Jeroboam, his however many greats, grandfather. And it's important, I think, to point out that the evil in these cases was often really, really evil, occasionally tied up in child sacrifice rituals that Israel occasionally adopted from other pagan religions. So, according to the pattern of the book of Kings, Jonah should have prophesied that God was going to punish Israel by allowing their enemies to score victories against them. But apparently, Jonah prophesied the very opposite of that. He predicted that during the reign of the second king Jeroboam, the borders of Israel would be restored. According to verse 25, that Israel was going to gain back some of the land that had previously lost. And Jonah's prophecies come true. They come to fruition because he was a true and right prophet. Despite the evil king and the people's own terrible sin, God allowed Israel a period of good fortune during this time. And why? Why did God do that? Why did he break the pattern? Verse 26 tells us why. For the Lord had seen how bitterly everyone in Israel, whether slave or free, was suffering. There was no one to help them. God had mercy on his people. He showed them grace in a particularly difficult time, even when their sins and their shortcomings did not merit it. And it was the prophet Jonah, who in our story is currently sitting beside the city of Nineveh, waiting for the fire from heaven to rain down. It was Jonah that bore witness to this act of mercy and grace in Israel's history. He's the one that the author decided to make the main character of this story. It's almost funny, isn't it? The second clue left for us by the author of the book to reveal to us why God is so insistent that Jonah accept the fact that he has decided to show grace to Nineveh. The second clue is the precise phrasing of Jonah's loud objections in chapter 4, verse 2. I've pointed out several times already the strangeness and the irony of Jonah's objections here, the fact that he seems to be attacking the Lord specifically for the Lord's merciful and loving nature. I knew you were gracious and slow to anger. It's a really tragically funny little scene. But I think that there's even more going on here than we've already pointed out. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That phrase, and very close versions of that phrase, pop up a bunch of different places throughout the Old Testament. It's a very important verse. I've heard it described as the John 3:16 of the Hebrew Bible before. It's just a core fundamental truth in the Old Testament. This is the very first time the phrase shows up. In Exodus 34, verse 6, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And the surrounding circumstances here in Exodus 34 are very important. Exodus 34 is right after the people of Israel made the most boneheaded and stupid decision in their entire history as a people. God had freed them from slavery in Egypt only a few chapters before. Then Moses went up onto Mount Sinai in order to get the law straight from the mouth of God. While he was up there, the people apparently got bored and impatient or something, so they told Moses' brother Aaron, hey, Moses is taking forever. Go ahead and make us a couple golden calves, and we're going to go ahead and worship them as gods. And Aaron does it. So Moses comes back down from the mountain, and he finds the people debasing themselves by worshiping these lumps of metal instead of the God that had just parted the Red Sea for them. Moses suspects that God might wipe out the people and just start over. But God doesn't do that. He shows the people mercy. He continues to work his plan of redemption through the descendants of Abraham. Because Exodus 34 verse 6 tells us the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Do you see how ironic it is for Jonah to use this verse, this phrase, as a set of insults to hurl back at God? Jonah knows where this verse comes from. Every single Israelite would have known where it comes from the moment when Israel had royally screwed up, had spat in God's face by worshiping golden calves, and God showed Israel mercy and grace anyway. If the Lord wasn't merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, Israel would not be here. Jonah himself would not be here. And yet in Jonah chapter 4, when these characteristics of God are directed at Nineveh, Jonah can barely stand it. The late Reverend Billy Graham once said that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Historically speaking, this is almost definitely not true, right? The cross was on the hill of Golgotha after all. But metaphorically, I think he is getting at something. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. You see, Jonah is falling into an all-too-human trap. When he looks at the real and terrible misdeeds of Nineveh, he is rightfully angered, but he allows his anger to obscure all of his own flaws and the flaws of his own nation and of his own people group. He has forgotten the points in his own history and in the history of Israel where they desperately needed, where they required the mercy and grace of God, and where they were happy to accept it. This is something that humans do. When we have defined an enemy, when we have decided that some other person or group is evil, we tend to allow potentially righteous indignation to fester into simple-minded and single-minded hate. We can no longer see context. We can no longer see the complexity in the other person or the other situation. They've been reduced solely to the things that they have done that hurt us or angered us. And we, by comparison, we just start to look better and better in our own eyes until we come to the conclusion that we barely need God's grace and those other people simply don't deserve it. But in reality, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Now, I don't think that this is to just iron out all moral difference between all people. I don't take Billy Graham's quote to mean that the Israelites are just as bad as the Assyrians, or that we are all just as bad as some of history's, worst tyrants. But I do think that it reminds us that we are all implicated in the evil and the brokenness of the world, that we are all entangled and trapped and corrupted by the web of human sin that has turned God's good world into a place of violence and pain that we see all around us. None of us, to put it in the language of the Bible, really know our right hand from our left. And when we balk at the fact that the restoration of all of this, the redemption of the world, it might include the redemption and the forgiveness even of our enemies, well, that's when we are in danger of choking on the hard edge of God's grace. I noted at the beginning of this sermon that the book of Jonah ends abruptly, without closure. It is a strange ending. We don't get God's response, or Jonah's response to God's final question. We don't know if he's ever able to come to terms with the hard edge of God's grace, the sometimes difficult reality that God's grace is extended even to those that we are convinced don't deserve that. And so why is it? Why does the book end this way? Well, we have talked at length the past couple weeks about how the character of Jonah is standing in for God's people. He represents us in this story, and I think that the ending of the book thrusts these questions back on to us. What is our response going to be? How will we react to the universality of God's grace? Are we going to go through life jealously guarding God's grace for ourselves, eager to bask in it ourselves, but reluctant to extend it to this person or to this group of people? Or are we going to be able to rejoice in the wonderful works of a merciful and gracious God who can redeem even the darkest and most broken places of the world that he loves for his own glory? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.